The Atlanta Hawks are in an awful position. After having so much success alongside with the acquisition of a ton of talent to this Hawks roster, many were extremely excited about the Hawks' future. But after having somewhat of a disappointing season last year, alongside with the way they're playing so far this year with a 17-18 record, people are getting concerned. And the position that the Hawks are currently in is certainly not one that you want to be in. But quickly, before we get the video started, for those of you who may not know, I'm Juicy Sports. I make opinion native NBA content, and if you guys enjoy videos similar to this, hit that subscribe button, that like button, and that post notification bell. I also want to quickly mention that I recently started up an MMA channel, and if you guys are interested in that, the link will be in the description. But anyways, let's get into it. When you look around the NBA and you talk about the more talented teams in the league, not how well they're playing, but just based upon how much talent they have on the roster, I think the Atlanta Hawks are up there with the best of them. When you talk about guys like Trae Young, of course, DeJounte Murray, John Collins, Bogdan Bogdanovic, DeAndre Hunter, Clint Capella, there's just so many different guys on this roster that are extremely talented. And the crazy thing about the Hawks is they have a very talented and very high-level starting lineup, but they also have a very talented and high-level bench unit as well. And when you just look at the Atlanta Hawks on paper, you would probably think they would be one of the better teams in the NBA. And of course, in previous years, they have been. But over the past two seasons, last year and so far early on into this season, the Hawks just haven't been the same. They still have very similar talent, probably even more talent with the acquisition of DeJounte Murray this offseason, but they're just not meshing nearly as well as they used to. And of course, it's still early on into the season. There's a ton of time to turn things around for the Hawks, and it's not like the Hawks are having an atrocious start, they're just not having a good one. But at this point, besides the record, when you just watch them out there, it is pretty clear that they do have some issues, both offensively and defensively. In the past, especially in the playoffs, the Hawks were actually a pretty good defensive team. And offensively, they were just lights out. Led by Trae Young, either he was scoring on you at will, or he was facilitating to his teammates, and they were draining three-point jumpers at will. They were just an incredible three-point jump shooting team. And although they still have a lot of the same guys on the roster now than they did during that playoff run a couple years back, the Hawks just don't look as good as they did back then offensively. And also defensively, they have their issues as well. So obviously, they're just not nearly as good of a team as they were in the past. But as I mentioned, it's still very early on into the season, and all that could change very quickly for them. But before I talk about how the Hawks can turn their future around and really turn their season around, let's first quickly touch upon why I think the Hawks are in an awful position. Now, obviously the Hawks don't have a great record, especially considering the talent they have on the roster, so of course that alone wouldn't be a good situation. But there's also a couple other factors for why I think the Hawks are in such a terrible situation. Now, the first reason that I want to touch upon is the fact that they don't really have all that many draft picks going forward. Now, when you talk about an organization, the best thing you can do is A, draft effectively, that's the most important thing you can do, but also B, make the right moves in all other aspects as well. But if you don't have your draft picks, it's going to be very difficult to improve your roster. Of course, it is possible, maybe the players that you already have on your team just improve naturally, and you don't need to make any moves to really improve your team. There's also ways you can do it in free agency and the trade market, but the easiest and most clear way to improve your team is through the draft. But when you look at the Atlanta Hawks, they don't have all that many draft picks going forward, as they did deal a bunch of them in the DeJounte Murray trade. So if the Hawks aren't gelling well now, and they're just not playing well whatsoever, and you don't have a lot of draft picks going forward, you're then in a pretty bad situation. Now, there's always the possibility that the Hawks move one of their players on the roster in exchange for some draft picks, but I just don't think it's all that realistic unless they blow things up. Because at this point, they're in win now mode, they wouldn't have made that DeJounte Murray deal if they weren't, so it's just not something that I think is all that realistic. But the next reason that I want to touch upon for why the Hawks are in such a terrible situation is due to their cap space. The Hawks have one of the highest salaries in the NBA. They have a ton of talent on the roster, and they have a ton of different players that require that. But if the Hawks aren't playing well as a unit, that doesn't really matter, and now you're in a terrible situation no matter how much talent you have on your roster. Because if you're a team that doesn't have any salary, so you can't improve in free agency, and you also don't have draft picks, it's going to be nearly impossible to improve. And really the only way the Hawks could improve is if they're able to make a good trade for themselves in the trade market. Maybe they can also find a player at the buyout market, but that's really it. There's nothing else they can really do. And there's certainly no major changes they can make, so if their roster now isn't playing well, they're just in a terrible situation. And as crazy as this may sound, considering how promising and how good they were a couple seasons back, I think if the Hawks don't improve this season and they have another okay year, and maybe if they hold on to the same roster next year and they have the same result, I think it would probably be time to blow things up. Now, there already have been some reports saying that Trae Young may request a trade out of Atlanta, which would be an absolute bombshell, and at that point, of course, the Hawks would blow everything up and rebuild. But even if that doesn't happen, I do think it probably would be time to do something like that by the end of next season if they have the same level of success that they have gotten over the past couple years. But that's an absolute doomsday scenario. At this point, it's still very early on into the season, as I mentioned, and they have plenty of time to turn things around. They just added a significant piece in DeJounte Murray, and usually when you add a piece that big, an all-star caliber player to your roster, it typically takes around half a year to fully feel comfortable with your teammates and fully live up to your potential. Of course, it could take longer than that, but the bare minimum is usually around half a season. But now, let's talk about how the Atlanta Hawks can turn things around and how they can really change their future. Now, obviously, offensively, things aren't meshing all that well, especially between DeJounte Murray and Trae Young. Both of those guys typically require the ball in their hands, especially Trae Young, and when you have two of those guys on your roster, typically it doesn't pan out. Now, there are certain situations where it does, but so far early on into the season, it's looking like these two guys don't play the best together. Now, with time, it's possible that they play better, and honestly, I would expect them to play better, but I don't know if they're ever going to get to a point where they're playing very well together. So in order for the Hawks to improve, I would like to see them play just better offensively as a whole. Maybe they can mismatch DeJounte's and Trae Young's minutes a little bit like they have been doing somewhat, but do it a little bit more and really just have your starting unit as Trae Young's team and your bench unit as DeJounte Murray's team. Now, I'm not saying bench DeJounte Murray, but just stagger their minutes so there's always one of those two players on the court at all times. And I think if the Hawks were to do that, their offense would mesh a little bit better, but there still are other problems. Of course, other guys on the roster need to shoot a little bit better from three. That's what the Hawks are based upon. If they're not hitting that three-point jump shot, they're probably not going to play all that well that particular game or that particular season if it lasts that long. Now, another thing they need to focus on is defense. Defense is always something you need to focus on as any team in the NBA, and in my opinion, I think defense is the most important thing. If you're a really good defensive team, without having all that much success offensively, I think you can be a 40-win team in the NBA. Because a lot of times defense leads to offense, of course, as we all know, and it's just extremely important. So the fact that the Hawks aren't playing all that well defensively, alongside with the issues that they're having offensively, that's why we're seeing these issues. But if they're able to clean up offensively a little bit, but mostly defensively, then I think they can truly turn things around, especially come time for the playoffs. But of course, a lot of those things are what ifs, and I guess only time will tell what does end up happening with that. But the Hawks are certainly in a very interesting situation, and a situation that you really don't want to be in whatsoever. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the Atlanta Hawks are in an awful situation, and do you think they can get out of it, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these two videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out, guys.